I have 10 years visiting India in my career, and my last visit to come and be in India was in July 2019. It was 3 years ago, and of course the pandemic saw that we were all locked down. So that brings me here today. It's a great pleasure to be here and share some thoughts with you. It's also amazing to see such a packed room. Really amazing to see that, and that the Indian poultry industry is clearly full steam ahead. Something else that got a little packed over COVID was my fit in this suit. So maybe we can say that's an impact of COVID. Before I begin, I'd like to just acknowledge the organisational committee for this Knowledge Day, for the invitation to come and speak to you. It's a great honour for me to do that, and I'm very, very happy to be here today. I can see that we've got a very, very full program, some really good presentations. I hope that you get to take something away from all of the presentations today. Make full use of those topics. While we're on topics, my topic for today that I have great pleasure to talk to you on is genetics, breed performance in modern times. And just to start, I'll give a brief overview of my talk, just two topics split in half. I'll start with lifting the curtain a little bit for you on what happens with R&D and at the primary breeder level, what steps and technology that's employed to make sure that we get the genetic improvement. Then the second part of my talk, I'll cover more about fundamentals of management for extracting the full genetic potential from broilers. Okay, if we start looking at the picture and the evolution of R&D in our industry, we can see that around 1960, the selection process was quite simple. Really, only a couple of traits were measured. And then we can see a gradual progression to what we have today, with over 40 traits evaluated at a primary breeder level. We can see that we're selecting not only broiler traits, but also breeder performance, processing, and welfare traits. That's becoming more and more important for our end consumer to know that our chicken is safe and the animal is treated well. So over 40 traits are evaluated here. One thing that I will mention is normally there's an antagonism between reproductive trait and broiler trait. With latest technology, we can now see breeder performance improving every year, year on year, at the same time a primary breeder can deliver improving broiler performance. And here I've laid out a typical introduction of technology in an R&D timeline. If you look at this, we start in 1960, moving all the way to current day today. And I would encourage you all to look at the timeline and consider when you entered the poultry industry. Think about when you came into work in the industry. For myself, 1986, somewhere about here. So quite a lot of technology has been developed since myself personally, I've been working in the industry. We can see that we started with mass selection in the 1960s with simplified identifying traits that we want, simple traits, and selecting those. And we can see as timeline progresses, we're moving to traits such as heart and lung function with pulse oximeter. We have multi-environment, where we are taking siblings, brothers and sisters from pedigree birds, and we're placing them into different environments, assessing their performance, and then selecting based on the learning from that. We can see new technology being introduced here with individual feed stations and individual birds fitted with RFID tags, and we measure the feed and water that the birds are consuming. That helps us make decisions for FCR and welfare traits. We can also see digital X-ray and use of computer tomography or CT scanning, and more recently, the use of genomics. And we'll talk a little more on that, but that genomics really helps us to make fast decisions that will help us bring the breeder performance forward at the same time as the broiler. Okay, so a modern selection process. We're looking at collecting a lot of data from our birds in a pedigree situation. We can see here some eggs. These eggs all have barcodes. The hen is trap nested, so we know the female, and then that is barcoded, so we know the mother. Then we're using genomics when the chick hatches to take a blood sample, and then we know the father. And that allows us to have multi-groups in our selection process so that we know the impact of male activity, female receptivity, and other factors. We also still, to this very day, have people putting their hands on the birds. Traditional selection methods are still maintained. So all of this process is additive. As we bring extra technology into the system, we maintain the previous and bring in the new. Also, we mentioned the use of, the use of the CT scanning technology. All of this, plus many other methods of building data, build a huge repository of information. Per breeding animal, I'm told that we're now up to 250,000 data points for every pedigree animal in primary breeding operations. So that huge amount of information comes through to a computer system. Here, this looks like a gaming desktop computer. In reality, the primary breeder is using modern supercomputers. In fact, a number of these to crunch the data. So now the computer and some very smart software is looking at all of this information so that we can end up with a yes or no decision for the selection team. So that is people in a chicken house with pedigree birds selecting and making a decision, is this bird in or not? So no longer is it just, let's pick up that bird, see how heavy it is. We're taking into account all of this information, and that's enabling that fast genetic progress to continue. Here we have a predicted rate of improvement for a product that's commercially available in India. And we can see we have both broiler traits and breeder traits. And if you look, all of these traits are predicted to move positively. Over from 2022 through to 2026, looking forward, we can expect to see this kind of rate of improvement in our broiler stock and in our breeders. More eggs, more hatchability, bringing us more chicks, at the same time that we're seeing an improvement in FCR. So you might be wondering, how can we predict accurately what happens in 2026? If we consider the timeline with the generations, at the pedigree level, we understand what's happening with these birds, and we can see the broiler impact and the rate of change. So within a primary breeding operation, we know today what is going to happen once we multiply through the generations from GGP, GP, PS to broiler, and ultimately to the consumer in the market. And that time frame takes around 4 to 5 years. So what we see in a pedigree breeding operation, 4 to 5 years to come into reality to the customer. Here's some data just to show the trends and what we can see with performance over time. The first chart here, we have adjusted FCR. This represents 226 companies globally. So there are literally billions of broilers in this information set. And we can see over this period of time that we've had an improvement, and this is an average improvement of 1.9 points of FCR year on year. At the same time, we see our average daily gain improving with a rate of almost 17 grams at 40 days, year on year. There are not many products that you can buy in the market that every year you get a better version of what you had last year. And the reason for that is the work that goes in at that pedigree level. This chart comes to us from the National Chicken Council in the US, and they've mapped FCR and average daily gain of broilers since selections and the industry really began in 1925. What we can see is quite a fast rate of improvement through to about 2005 in both FCR and in average daily gain. After 2005, we see a more consistent year-on-year improvement. And what we see over time, that continual improvement is helping us bring more affordability to our customers and to the end user, more sustainability, and better food security. If we consider looking at 1955 broiler and comparing to today's modern broiler, there is a massive difference we can see here. Recently, in 2020, Dr. Zarek and Fairchild at University of Georgia did a comparison, and this is really graphic. What we see here is an Athens Canadian random bred, which is a pure line that's been maintained from the 1950s. Without any genetic progression, that's what your broiler today would look like. But we know we have a bird that looks more like this. And the actual improvement is quite outstanding. Over 5 times the growth rate. We can see to achieve a 2 kilo weight, that 1950s broiler would have to be growing to 157 days of age, compared to 31 today. The feed consumption also, quite amazing. We're saving 3.5 kgs of feed to the same weight. And if you're in the broiler industry, you know that that's a big number. That got me thinking, and I was wondering about how that might compare in the Indian market. So I did a little bit of analysis, and I asked around, and I understand, and this figure may be a little conservative, this was provided by JIRA, who are a global protein export-import advisory business. They tell me there are 7 crore placed per week, broiler DOC, 70 million birds per week. That brings 3.6 billion broilers in India placed per year and 3.3 billion birds to market. Those are massive numbers. If we look at the modern broiler today, 1.72 FCR, let's just assume about there, and consuming 11.5 million metric tons of feed annually. Huge numbers. Let's compare with that ARCB, the bird from the 50s. Okay, so same volumes, but now it's going to take us 157 days to grow those birds with an FCR of 3, and we're now consuming 20,000 or 20 million metric tons of feed. If we apply some economics to that, we can see that difference of 9 million metric tons of feed at a feed cost of $580 per metric ton. That difference is 5.3 billion US dollars, or, and I hope I got this right, 42,678 crore INR. Huge numbers. So that gives us some appreciation for all of the primary breeding companies, what we have today with the modern broiler. Okay, if we consider this equation here, your field performance, the P, is a result of not just the genetics, but also the environment. So G times E equals P. And when we're considering the environment, we're considering your temperature and humidity and airspeed and control of that, but also your health status, nutrition, and management of the birds. Holistically, all of those traits add through to your environment. Another way to consider this is the genetic improvement, and I look at these birds as technology. The technology that you have in the modern chicken is your foundation for success. And you add in, on top of this genetics, the health, nutrition, environment, and your management inputs. And you end up with your field performance. What we would like to see in an ideal situation is our delta P, or our change in performance, equals our delta G. If we're keeping pace with the genetic prediction, with our own field performance, we are managing our environment and everything in between here optimally. And that's our end objective. But we know that's not often the case. We have challenges to deal with. So we can see our field performance not always matching to those genetic predictions. Here is some broiler performance from India. Each dot on this chart represents a completed broiler result. We can see some seasonal information here with hot season in red, and in grey, your winter, which is really just still hot, but varying degrees. If we look at this and analyse what's happening here, we can see that the top end, where the worst performance is, so this we are looking at corrected FCR, so higher is worse. We see a lot of variability here, and there's no real trend. So there's a lot of noise and a lot of things going on. That's the result of our environment and all the challenges that we face: heat stress, disease challenges, all the management, nutrition, raw materials. So those are our challenges that we have to deal with. If we look at the top performance line, we don't see quite the same amount of variation. That's because those best producers identify and eliminate those things that cause that variation. So that's the genetic side. This green line here is really indicating the genetic potential, and over time we can see, even in India, these are real results, very good genetic improvement. So while you might not see it in your operations, we've got a lot of room where we could either be up here or down here. And that says to me opportunity. So now the question comes, how do we extract that full potential from our genetics? Firstly, we want to lead with a freedom of disease and maximum livability. That's pretty obvious. Keep the birds alive, lower mortality, we're going to do better. But not only that, and even more important, is that subclinical health issues that rob your performance. You may not always see or really feel how much of an impact subclinical disease is taking on your business. You sure can see the mortality. That's a physical hard number, but we can't see the impact always of that subclinical health issues. A key one here, driving feed intake, and it's not just feed per se, but what are the things that drive intake? So we're talking lights, we're talking water, we're talking ventilation, keeping the birds comfortable, and we're talking feed form. Then in addition to that, we need to make sure that we're providing the best nutrient level that's proper package delivery to the bird to meet its need at the right time. We also need to make sure that the birds are free of stress and able to express their full potential. Now we have a conflict here with making sure that we are economic and we have the throughput and stocking densities, for instance. So there's always a bit of a play to make sure we're removing stress, but we also need to be economic. Okay, so I'll go through a little bit of a section touching on each of these. Hopefully you have heard the term flaws used before. It's something that we use in our industry to explain those fundamental points of feed, lights, air quality, water quality, and sanitation. For me, this is really more about biosecurity than sanitation, but FLORB probably isn't a very good an acronym, so FLORS it is. Now this looks very simple, but it's as complex as you want to go. These things are fundamental to your success, and to be honest, each one of these points could be a very detailed presentation or a whole seminar for a number of days. In fact, we have people like Dr. Susan Watkins and Dr. Mike Zarek who spend their entire life in research universities just looking at water, in the case of Dr. Susan Watkins, or ventilation with Dr. Mike Zarek. So this looks simple, but can be as detailed as you want to go. The message for me today, and I'd like to draw on a quote from H.J. Hines, who said, "To do a common thing uncommonly well brings success." And that could not be more true for our industry. These things that I'm going to talk about are very basic. Perhaps you already know a lot about these topics, but I'd like to emphasize the importance of getting it right all the time. Okay, so our first stop on our roadmap, I'd like to talk a little bit about feed. And what better place to start is with our starter. So if we look at feed form, we need to make sure we're providing a very good coarse crumb. And the reason for that is to drive feed intake. Here's a good example. Here's another example. In this case, you're looking at a 2mm extruded pellet. And that's perfectly acceptable. In fact, it's very desirable for chicks to receive a diet like this as their starter. You can see there are no fines in here, and every beakful is going to be densely packed nutrient. You're going to drive feed intake with a diet like this. But what we can also see in places, I travel right across Asia, not just in India, we can see diets that resemble more like this. And I know we have challenge with some of our raw material quality with our corn. Our corn soy diets are renowned for not having good durability, but we can produce a good starter. In fact, I found one in India in my travels. It's possible. This was an exceptional example in a broiler operation. I would be very happy if I was feeding my chickens feed that looked like this. If we look here, this is a feed sieve. It has division, which allows various particle sizes, in this case less than 1mm, 1 to 2, 2 to 3. Here we can hardly see any fines in this feed sample. That's perfect. What I also like to see, 40% in this 2 to 3 category. The chicks are perfectly looking for feed like this. You'll drive feed intake and really good 7-day weights with feed of this quality. If we move through to our grower feed, the pelleted diets, this is one of the best examples of pelleted feed that I've seen in my travels, and it was here in a broiler producer in India. I use this in examples for presentations wherever I go about what you can achieve in terms of diet presentation. But we can also very commonly see feed that looks like this. And that is hurting your daily intake, and you're not driving feed intake when we have a diet like this. It's possible. We need to focus on it and make sure we've got good durability and a good pellet form. Just quickly, this was a fairly old field study, but here, after the birds were started, they moved in this trial under 3 treatments. The first treatment only fed pelleted feed, the second treatment a 50-50 blend, and the third treatment only fines. And when we look at the results, we can see quite a significant difference and a linear response in terms of our body weight gain and similarly with our FCR. So the birds that were fed 100% pellets all the way through, grew the best, and gained the most weight, got the best FCR. So it's fairly obvious to see feed form and making sure that the birds are getting the best quality feed form is critical. Another point, again, these are really detailed, simple things that you can do. We want to flood the feeders when we're brooding our birds. We can see here the feeder is nice and full. The chicks have got great access to that starter feed. On the example on the left here, we can see we have feed in here, but also rice hull. So we're not presenting the best opportunity for the birds to eat feed in this example. It's a small detail, but simply placing paper under the tray when you're brooding can make a huge difference to feed availability and the opportunity to consume feed. Once we've brooded, we then need to make sure we're managing our feeding system to the best of our ability. We need to gradually reduce the volume of feed in the feed pan and at the same time start lifting that feeder. We can see here in this example, we have pellets in the pan, so we must have birds that are past brooding, maybe 14 days of age, 20 days of age, yet this feeder pan right on the litter, it's full. And you may be able to make out there are pellets and we have feed spillage. Doesn't look like a lot, so maybe it's not much of a problem. Well, in another example, we're looking at feed spillage. In this one here, we can see there's a little bit of feed just on the litter surface. When we explore and take a deeper look, we pull the rice hull back, we can see there's a lot of feed there, quite a lot. In fact, handfuls. So what's hidden behind the surface of that litter is FCR and performance. So I would encourage you to go and pay attention to this, have a look, see how you're managing your feeding systems, and look at if you have any feed spillage. Just a point here, 1 point of FCR. How much are we talking? Well, in this example, a 30,000 broiler controlled house, FCR of 1.6. Let's say we're going to lose 1 point of FCR. So we adjust that to 1.61. For that house, over its market age, we're going to feed an additional, or lose an additional 616 kilos of feed. That's equivalent for 1 point. Still sounds like a lot. We wouldn't think that you're losing 600 kilos of feed in a broiler house. Well, if we think about a typical house, controlled environment house, will have 480 pans. And if we divide that 600 kilos by those 480 pans, that's 1.28 kilos of feed per pan. Now, we don't assume that we're going to have any spillage in the first 14 days. Pans are going to be on paper, so that all that feed is going to be consumed. But after the 14 days, we have here, we can assume that we're going to have some feed spillage. So let's say between 14 and market age of 37 in this case, that's 23 days of spillage activity. And that equates to just 56 grams of feed per pan per day. Really not much. So there's an example of 56 grams of feed. It's not a lot of feed. In fact, I think I may have brought a prop with me. 56 grams of mince, just here. That's all we have to lose. Per pan per day, 1 point of FCR, up in smoke. So paying attention to your feeding system can give you big rewards. Your feed presentation really is important, and it's worth focusing on. From the first pan, your feeder line, right to the end. So there are some methods and approaches that you can adopt to make sure that you're presenting feed in a good form Feeding systems can tend to break down the feed particles. We end up with fines. There are methods to clean up the pans and provide a better presented feed form. All right, that's enough on feed. I'm fairly limited for time today, so we can't cover into too much detail. We move on. Let's talk about lighting for a little bit. Okay, so for broilers, the response to day length does not matter between the sexes. Male or female, they'll respond the same. And it's quite a misconception, but providing too long a day length can adversely affect your growth rate, your feed intake, mortality, and welfare traits. Here is a field study that was done with a customer in Asia. We can see 500,000 birds more for each set of test. The first set were managed with 24 hours of light, and the second with just 20 hours. So 4-hour dark period at night time. And we can see over this number of broilers a very positive impact in terms of 1% mortality, better, almost 5 points of FCR improve, and 2 grams daily gain. So we can see there we really can have a positive impact, and the birds need to have a sleep. Putting lights on 23, 24 hours is having a negative impact. So our welfare is optimized between 17 and 20 hours of light, and that light must be uniformly distributed without any shadows in the house. Okay, so if we look at some data on some field studies, this is around 10 years old, but I realize some recent information verifies what we see here. So we can see in terms of day length effect on body weight, there is a optimum peak at 20 hours daylight, 4 hours dark period. Moving to FCR, we see a positive impact at 14 hours day length or 10 hours dark period. And in terms of mortality, there is a sweet spot there at 17 hours of light. Now that dark period should be given in one block at night time. Allow the birds to rest and sleep. Here we can see some pictures with a very nice uniform light distribution. The chicks can see where to find the feed and water. That's perfect in a brooding situation. And we want to avoid this type of situation where we've got variable light and shadows in the house. Okay, moving on to our air quality. We need to focus, it's a big thing in India, heat stress and mitigation of that heat stress. Not only do we have to manage the environment that you have, but we also have the bird growing faster every year. Now, the primary breeder is not going to take the foot off in terms of broiler gain and improvement. So the birds are going to grow faster. That increased growth rate is going to produce more heat, and we have to deal with that. You might not notice a difference 1 year to the next, but I can guarantee if you look at it between a 10-year cycle, there's quite a big difference. So we have to bear in mind the bird is going faster, and we have a challenge, particularly in hot season in India. This chart is looking at here, just to explain, we have a maintenance energy requirement, and here this is moving along an axis of temperature. So over to the left, it's getting colder, over to the right, getting warmer. We can see the impact of energy, maintenance energy requirement as it gets colder. There's a linear relationship. The bird needs more energy. At the same time, the bird is consuming slightly more feed, but not enough to keep up with this energy demand, and we end up with a deficit. Similarly, as the bird starts to get heat stressed, the energy requirement increases as mechanisms within the bird, from panting and so forth, to mitigate that heat stress, that takes energy. At the same time, we can see that the bird's feed intake is going to be affected, and that also creates an energy deficit. So we need to be in this optimal zone here, and really paying attention to our birds. Looking out for signs of panting, birds standing with their wings drooped. I'm sure you've seen plenty of that. In an ideal situation, the bird's thermal comfort should be determined by how the bird feels and our husbandry and stockmanship to look at the birds. Temperature, humidity, airspeed, and also feather cover are all very important aspects of effective temperature, how the bird feels. We can't ask the bird, but we can certainly observe and see what's happening. So paying attention to what the bird is telling us will tell us, are we in this thermal neutral zone, or do we have a problem? And what we should see for a guide, maximum of 5% of the birds should be panting. Okay, in India, we can see many open houses. I've been coming to India for 10 years and working a lot in broiler operations that are successfully farming in open houses. But the future is going to be controlled environment. And we need to move the industry in India this way. And there are a number of reasons why I say this. We know that the structure is expensive. It costs money to build it, to run it, the energy that goes in. But if we are seriously in business in the poultry industry, we need to give the bird the environment that it needs to extract that genetic potential. And there is a return on your investment with this. We can see very good insulation. We can see cool cells with evaporative cooling. We have fans running that are creating an airspeed that we control, hence the term environmental controlled house. We can see here, in this case, 3.4 meters per second, and if we look at the open house, who knows? We do know, in this case, there's not a lot of thermal insulation, so radiant heat from the sun is going to make an impact, and we really have no control over what's happening in terms of airspeed over the birds. So again, we've got some limitation in our ability to manage with the open-sided house. This was a study that was done in Thailand, in Bangkok Animal Research Facility. This was looking at the effect of open versus closed house, and this study was completed in March 2019. We can see the advantage clearly sits with the closed house. 194 grams of live weight, a whole 10 points of FCR, and 2% livability. Now this was pen trial, not in a commercial density, but we can still see there is a huge impact here. When we consider the investment to construct closed house, if we're thinking about our returns, 10 points of FCR, there's going to be a payback there. When we're thinking about ventilation of those controlled environment houses, we need to think more modulation. We need more systems built to give us control. And unfortunately, what we do see right across Asia, a lot of the modern EC houses are constructed just with almost like a big lever. The ventilation system is fully on or it's fully off. And we need to introduce a bit more dynamics into that. We know in India, temperature can be very hot, 38 degrees in this example, and here 20% humidity, so nice and dry. That gives us the ability to add evaporative cooling and have a huge impact on that heat stress. So that's important. But equally important, I travelled from New Zealand to be here, and I woke up this morning at 3 a.m. with jet lag, and I happened to look at my phone at the weather in Hyderabad, and it was 20 degrees. So it can get quite cool at night. We can't forget about the night time. Even I can see projected this Sunday is forecasting 15 degrees C. So nighttime, we're going to be cool. So if we think about tunnel ventilation, it's great when we have hot weather and the birds are fully feathered. That's very important because a lot of the environmentally controlled houses are installed with just this one system. Air enters the cool cell, it's extracted down the length of the house through the extraction fans. Now that system is only part of a ventilation system for an EC house. We also need to allow for side inlets. They're very critical. And even though in India you don't have a huge demand for minimum ventilation, we need these side inlets for what we call transitional ventilation. And this is what we're talking about, where we're bringing air into the house, not just through the cool pads, but also through our side inlets. And it's just allowing us the ability to modulate and not just bring in a huge volume of super cool air when we have chicks that aren't fully feathered, when we don't need all of that horsepower. Okay, watching your birds is really critical when we're talking ventilation and temperature control. In this case, this was a farm that I visited brooding, and we can clearly see these chicks are cold, they're huddling. Very easy to see that. We can't afford 1 hour where the birds, the modern broiler, is given a substandard environment. 1 hour, we're impacting the opportunity for feed intake on these birds. On the same farm, go to the next house, and we can see, in this case, the chicks are too hot. They're trying to get away from the heat source, and they're not taking feed either. So that also is a problem. And it's looking at what's happening and responding that's important here. And as luck would have it, we go to the third house, and I kid you not, everything was perfect. So it was an interesting example for me. 3 houses on a broiler farm, and we have 3 perfect examples of too cold, too hot, and just right. And if we look at this is not staged. This is just how we see the birds. There's good feeding activity going on. We're missing out here, and we're missing out here. And the only difference is, same farm, is just the management. So we're in control. When we have birds on our farms, we can decide, do we want the birds eating or not? Really important. It's fundamental stuff, but critical. Breeding temperatures can affect your crop fill. This is a recent study that was performed with 2 different breeding temperatures, 32 degrees here, 25 degrees here. You can see the difference visually with a thermal imaging. When we look at the crop fill at 24 hours, we can see there is a clear advantage for the birds that were on the recommended temperature profile. And in this case, 90% crop fill, 24 hours, compared to 81% crop fill in the cold environment. The birds are very sensitive to that cold temperature and will not crop up, and we can't achieve the right daily gain if we have a cold environment. And 25 degrees. So if we're brooding, even here in Hyderabad, at the moment, 20 degrees at night, maybe 15 degrees at night. Brooding chicks in that environment, the birds are going to be huddling and not consuming. As the birds get older, we still need to look at the birds. So observation and reacting to what we have. This is an ideal situation. We can see 1/3 of the birds eating, 1/3 of the birds resting, and 1/3 drinking. That is perfect. I don't see that very often. That's what we're trying to achieve with our birds as they age. If we see this scenario, something is not right. The birds are sitting, something has caused that. We need to investigate and rectify the situation. One example, we could look here, 29 degrees temperature, 82% relative humidity, and 4 meters per second airspeed. It's really good airspeed in this house, plenty of horsepower for cooling. And hopefully that's not too loud for you. What we can see, the birds are sitting. They're flat and they're not moving. We don't have a lot of activity on our feeders. We don't have a lot of activity on our drinker lines. You can see in this example, there's 8 fans running. We turn off half of the fans. And I appreciate, in this example, maybe too extreme, but we turn half of those fans off. We achieve 2.5 meters per second airspeed, and a few minutes later, this is what we have. Look at all the birds on the drinker lines. There's birds on the feeders. They've woken up. They want to eat, they want to drink, but we just had too much air coming over the birds. And this is that understanding that we have a really big system with a controlled environment house, but we need to fine tune. We need people that are managing those farms to look at the birds and react. Fine tune your ventilation, and you can make a big difference in terms of your profitability. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about water. We see a lot of bell drinkers in open houses in India, and drinker heights, quite a simple thing to get right. Doesn't cost us anything, just paying attention to the equipment, but really important in terms of quality of water and quality of litter. So we want the birds back to be level with the base of the bell drinker, like this. When we get it wrong, these are just examples. We can see not only the quality of the litter, but also the quality of the water that we're providing the birds. We can have pododermatitis start to develop. We start to culture bacteria and other organisms in the litter, and we're not providing sanitized water. For nipple drinker heights, we want to start out for young chicks with an angle 35 to 45 degrees from head to tail. As the chicks age, we then want to move to 75 to 85 degrees. Lift that drinker line up, get the birds reaching and stretching for the nipple. That's going to help achieve and drive a better water intake, and a better water intake leads to better feed intake. Your water needs to be clean and sanitized. I know that we all know this, but there are a few tricks, things to pay attention to. We can use a test kit like this, looking at free chlorine and our pH level, or we can also use ORP meter, oxidative reduction potential, which is looking at the difference in current in terms of millivolts. Higher reading, the better. So for free chlorine, we want to see 5 ppm ideally, and 6 to 6.8 of pH. For ORP, anything greater than 650 is perfect, which we have in this example here. Now, a little thing to bear in mind when we're using chlorine in our drinker systems. Chlorine, or free chlorine, is made up of 2 parts. We have hypochlorous acid and also hypochlorite ion. And depending on your pH level that we have here, you will affect the proportion of each of these in balance. Now, what's important is we can see the hypochlorous acid is the only thing that's going to kill the bacteria. If we have too much hypochlorite ion, we are not effectively sanitizing our water, even though we can see a good free chlorine. So, some examples that we can see. If we have a pH here of 6.6, we can see about 88% hypochlorous acid. And as we go down the line, 7.6, we can see about 45%, and finally down here at 8.2, about 20%. So we need to pay attention to the pH of your water. In this example, we can see a really strong free chlorine reading around about 2 parts per million. Maybe it could be higher. But we also see 7.6 pH. And if we look at the chart here, we're taking our hypochlorous and only 45% of that is available. So now we're only delivering 0.9 ppm of hypochlorous acid, which is doing our sanitation for us. So pay attention to the pH of your water. Make sure that you've got that free chlorine. If you ask me, I prefer to use ORP meter. It just takes into account all of that relationship. We can see here examples with acidic water, no chlorine. That's a poor result. Here we have good free chlorine, but an alkaline situation, still a poor ORP. And finally, here we have an acidic situation with good free chlorine and 725 millivolts. So ORP is the way to go. When we're looking at our drinker systems, make sure that they're clean. The drinker on the left, while we see a little bit of material here, it's not the dirtiest drinker I've ever seen. It's quite clean still. But when we test, only 220 ORP. All we do is clean that drinker, clean it, run the house water into the same drinker. Simply cleaning it raised our ORP now to an acceptable level. So regularly cleaning your drinking system is critical. Bell drinkers, this is one of the weaknesses with bell drinkers. Clean them regularly and you'll be surprised in terms of what impact that can have. Regardless of your drinker system, you want to make sure that you have good sanitized water, not only at the start of the drinker system, but also right at the end. And if we see a difference in the numbers, let's say we have a good sanitized result here and a poor result here, that could be telling us we have a problem with biofilm in our lines. And there are steps we can do to improve that. Something that we don't see a lot of across Asia is management of our water temperature. And I think this is another opportunity. Time and time again, I come across examples where the water temperature is too hot. In this example here, we're looking at a house in Thailand. There's a corridor connecting the houses, and along the side wall here, there is a water line. Maybe hard for you to see, but the temperature on this thermal imaging camera is showing us 41 degrees in that water line. That water is too hot. We can see an ambient temperature in here, 40 degrees C. So 40 degrees, 41 degrees on your water temperature, we're going to have an impact on your water intake and subsequently on your feed intake. If we look at this chart here, an ideal water temperature is between 18 to 21 degrees. And I know that's going to be hard for you to achieve in India most of the time, but there is a relationship here. The warmer we get, the less water is consumed. And it may be very easy to say, but I can't do anything about that. And I would disagree. I think there are options. We could see one example here. This is from an open house. At least they're taking some measures by putting the gunny sack and keeping that wet. But that's not enough. And we need to be a bit more creative in our solutions. If we look here, there's an impact in terms of our daily gain. We can see a trial with 3 treatments, one at 4 degrees Celsius, 21, and almost 38 degrees on water. Everything else was constant. What we can see is the growth rates for the first 2 treatments were almost identical, but we had quite a big impact in the 7-day and in the 14-day weights. Here, we can see from 187 grams to 167, so 20 grams at 7 days impact. That's hurting our feed intake right there. Now, this is not something that you might consider if you are farming in an open house. Your volumes are small, this equipment is expensive. But if you're putting 30,000 broilers into an EC house, or 40,000 birds, I don't think I see anyone using this type of device, but this equipment is out there. It's a recirculating water chiller. And it's just really like an air conditioning unit, and it will circulate. You program the temperature you want your header tank, and it will deliver water at that temperature. Technology is there to use it. I'll be very interested in some trial to see the result of managing in hot season your water temperature and how that can drive your feed intake. Okay, so that's just some thoughts there. Our last stop on our roadmap for flawless broiler performance is our biosecurity. We've already heard a lot about with disease, prevention is better than the cure. So vaccines and other additives that we may put into the system, we need to be careful on. So for me, biosecurity is the number one thing, paramount. And for me, it doesn't matter so much if you're a GP, parent stock, or broiler. It's equally important. And I know we hear, oh, if you're further down the chain, biosecurity doesn't matter so much on a broiler farm. You're producing food for your customers. Biosecurity matters throughout the entire chain. I'm limited today in time. I can't go through all of these points in detail, and it's not very clear on the slide here. I do understand you'll be getting a copy of the presentation, so you'll be able to read this in your own time. But there are a lot of points that we need to take control of. We should be looking at making sure every input to your broiler operation is clean and clear and good to go. Can't underestimate the impact, particularly in a country where you have challenge with health issues. Make sure that you're doing the best you can with your biosecurity. Okay, time for me just to quickly sum up. Primary breeding companies have literally invested billions of dollars. If we think about the duration of all of the R&D programs to get to the chicken of today, that investment is still going on. New technology is coming in. There are things that I haven't been able to show here that primary breeding companies are putting in place today that are going to ensure that genetic progression continues. We're not seeing at this stage any rate of slowdown in terms of that genetic change. That must come at some point. But today, we don't see it. So we can expect, at least in the next 6 years, 7, 10 years, that our genetic rate of change and progress is going to continue. Our management and our environmental inputs have to keep up with that genetic change. So the chicken that you get every year is changing. We need to keep up with our management, your ventilation systems, your nutrition, etc. Those fundamentals that I've just gone through in this short presentation are critical. But what's more critical is you applying those fundamentals extraordinarily well. That is the secret to getting this good success. And I know it's very easy to look at these things and say, oh, it's simple. Yeah, I know that's important. But it's the delivery every day, every hour that's important for these birds. You have to put the work in, and there is no substitute for that. If that work is not going in, we can't expect good results. So my advice to you is to focus on your flaws, limit those stresses that challenge the bird and drive that performance. And really, only after your flaws are flawless, make sure that they are spotless, should you then move to exploring deeper science and other things that may net you a very small gain. Okay, with that, I'd like to thank you for our journey through our improving our genetic potential and for your attention. Thank you.